Hello, 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 hello.
6:32.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the launch of a seminal book that we are very proud at NCEER, the National Council of Applied Economic Research, to have produced. The book is all about this century, and the question that the book poses, and I will introduce the author and of course our panelists, distinguished panelists in a minute, but the book asks the question, is this century Asia's? Now I have to tell you an inside secret that we held off on the release of this book because we were in deep consultations with this one place on Pennsylvania Avenue, and we had to time this to Mr. Trump's Asia visit. So we've managed to do that. The publishers were very unhappy that we were holding off on releasing the book, but we said we have to look at global affairs and do it in sync with Mr. Trump's visit to Asia. But that joke aside, I think the questions that this book raises are really fundamental to our own future. And since we are a very large part of Asia, clearly what happens here is also going to have a huge influence on that future. Historians love labels, and so it is that the 19th century was Great Britain's, and the 20th century was the United States, and of course everybody has rushed to claim the 21st century as Asia's. Is that too heroic? Is that premature? Is that just aspirational? I'm delighted to introduce Rajat Nag, who has authored this book and gave the lectures at NCAER on which this book is based. To my left, Rajat is Distinguished Fellow at NCAER. He until recently, and until he joined us, was the Managing Director General of the Asian Development Bank for a large number of years, and so had an extensive involvement in Asia's development. And it is that experience that he has brought to bear, both in this book and the lectures that preceded it. He shares with us his not only optimism for Asia's future and our ability to claim this century as ours, but he also, without rose-tinted glasses, asks the question, is this really realistic? Is this going to happen? And if so, what must happen in a number of different areas that would allow us to claim this century as ours? Rajat will tell us more about the book that he has written and the lectures he gave. But I want to take a second to also introduce my distinguished panelists. We could not have asked for a better duo of commentators who have come together at our request and are going to talk about their own thoughts about Asia in the context of this book. To my right, Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary of India, and a number of different diplomatic assignments, including Myanmar, Indonesia, Nepal, High Commissioner to Mauritius. He's of course the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change. He's was chairman of the National Security Advisory Board, and of course chairman of RIS, the Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries. He's a Padma Bhushan, as we know, and of course has written extensively on energy security, climate change, national and international related issues. To my extreme left, next to Rajat, is Sanjay Baru. Sanjay Baru is a person that has used his journalistic prowess to great effect. Currently, of course, the Secretary General of FICCI since September this year. Earlier, he was Director for Geoeconomics and Strategy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, a media advisor, of course, to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and his book, which introduced us to so many of the inside dealings that happened in 7 Race Course Road. The book that we, of course, greatly enjoyed reading, The Accidental Prime Minister, The Making and the Unmaking of Manmohan Singh. Sanjay, of course, has now made it his profession to write about prime ministers, because he's followed that up, as we know, with his seminal book on P.V. Narasimha Rao and how P.V. Narasimha Rao made history in 1991. He's been the editor of most of the major financial newspapers in India, has taught at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore, and is an honorary senior fellow and a member of the governing board of the Center for Policy Research. This is going to be a very exciting evening because I think we will not only look at what Rajat has done, but place it in the context which actually has changed quite dramatically between the year in which Rajat gave this talk and what we see now today as the future of not just Asia, but in many ways the future of our planet. So with that, let me turn to Rajat Nag and ask him to spend a few minutes telling us about his book. Rajat.
Thank you very much, Shekhar. But I'm told that first you've got to release the book. So you've got
release
to
the book or release the
if you don't do that, then I can't talk about it.
I actually have to do a bit of historical research about this Christmas present approach to.
Dr. Shah, thank you very much for your generous introduction, and of course also for the tremendous support that I've always got from NCAER, both for the lectures and this book. And Dr. Sarun and Dr. Baru, thank you very much, not only for being here today, but for the very strong support that you've always given me, and your intellectual contributions to this whole exercise of the discussions on the Asian century. Thank you very much. I think it's fair to say that there is much to be proud of what Asia has achieved in economic terms over the past several decades. Propelled by China and then joined by India and countries such as Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam. Asia really has achieved, I would say, in one generation, which took other countries several. Over the period 1990 to 2010, for example, Asia grew at about 8% annually, which is a phenomenal achievement. Of course, China was the main proponent of this, growing at 10, but India did very well at 6.5, and other countries followed. So the consequence of this 3 decades of growth was that the per capita incomes, the standard of livings in Asia increased dramatically, some more than others, but all countries in Asia did well. And one immediate consequence of that, of course, was hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty. Just to give some numbers, in 1970, which is just about 50 years back, not quite, 1 in every 2 Asian was poor, defined as $1 a day. By 1990, 20 years later, that had come down to 1 in every 3. And by 2010, it was down to 1 in every 5. Now that's a very dramatic achievement. Of course, large number of poor still. But the achievement Asia achieved really took the West and many other countries almost hundreds of years. I think it's fair to say that Asians today are richer, healthier, live longer, are more educated than even 4 decades back. But when, as Shekhar mentioned about looking ahead, we asked the question whether we were extrapolating the past a bit too readily and basically just basking in that euphoria and therefore declaring this is the Asian century. That is exactly what we wanted to question. And what we realized is that the quality of growth is just as important as the quantity of growth. And growth has to be sustainable. For Asia to really claim that this century is the Asian century, growth has to be sustainable. And for sustainable growth, what we really mean is it has to be inclusive, it has to be green, and it has to be clean. So those are the 3 essential points that I'll be making in this lecture, and which is what we talk about in this book. Now, on the need for inclusive growth, I mentioned about the phenomenal economic growth, and the standards of living per capita incomes have increased. China has increased almost about 6 times over the period 1970 to 2010. But Asia still suffers from large deprivations and rising inequalities. Again, some numbers. 2/3 of the world's poor, and that's about 740 million, which is double the population of the US, live on less than $1.25 a day. So in spite of the huge progress, we also have 2/3 of the world poor living in this continent. 1.7 billion people do not have access to basic sanitation. And 360 million people do not have access to clean water. Gender-based deprivations are a very major challenge. Millions of girls aren't even born due to cultural preferences. And maternal mortality remains very high in many countries, including India. So basically you have what one can call the two faces of Asia. One is bright and one is shining, and one has the glitzy towers of Delhi or Mumbai or Jakarta. And on the other hand, you have the slums and you have all the deprivations. Now, I think it's fair to say that even on the social indicators, Asia has done well. All the social indicators I've mentioned, if you look at the past 30, 40 years, they show an improvement, but still a long way to go. But where it has not improved is inequality. Asia today is more unequal than it was 40 years back. The Gini coefficient, which is the standard measure, 0 being most equal, 1 being most unequal, has actually increased from 0.39 in the mid-90s to 0.46 in the late 2000s. Now that is, Asia is the only region where inequality is actually increasing. In Latin America it's high, but even in Latin America it's decreasing. So basically the benefits of growth have not accrued to all, and the gap is widening. And the social consequences of this income inequality manifests all the way through. It manifests itself in education, in health, in child mortality, in gender deprivations. I'll just give you one example, then move on. In Pakistan, the net attendance rate for primary education for students from families in the lowest quintile, lowest 20%, was twice that of those from the lowest quintile. So basically, the richer people have greater access to education, richer access to health, and this generational disparities continues. And child mortality in many countries is much higher for the lowest than it is for the highest. So when we say Asia's child mortality rates are low, or high, sorry, it is actually very low for those at the upper end. It's those at the lower end who suffer and suffer a lot. So income inequality is, I think, a major challenge for Asia. And I personally think that if we don't have inclusive growth, it won't be too long before our growth will start to sputter out. And therefore, growth has to be inclusive, in which people at all spectrum will benefit. Some more than others, and that's okay. And I'm not getting into details about good inequality and bad inequality. Bad inequality is really inequality because of lack of opportunities, because of your gender, because of your birth circumstances, caste, religion, or whatever. But the bottom line is that without addressing inequality and the social deprivations, Asia's future cannot but be uncertain. And I'll end with one statistic on that section. 77 million children under the age of 5 are underweight in Asia. Now, 77 million underweight means that the 77 million people have essentially already been compromised for life. Because if you're stunted at age 5 because of malnutrition, you're stunted intellectually and physically for the rest of your life. Hence, the need for inclusive growth. Let me move on to green growth. And I don't think I have to say much, considering that you all braved the not so green situation outside. And for growth to be sustainable, it needs to be green. And I think the point is that if we have to shave a growth rate by 1 or 2 or even more percentage points, maybe it's worth it if it's sustainable. And green growth is a necessary condition for that to happen. Over the past 4 decades, it's only 4 decades, 40% of Asia's coral reefs have vanished. And when these coral reefs vanish, they're gone forever. And there's a multiplier effect of all the damages it has. China has lost 70% of its mangrove forests in the last 50 years. South Asia has lost 13% of forest area, which is basically an area roughly the size of Vietnam over the past 20 years. And Delhi's air quality, I don't need to talk about. And growth, which doesn't recognize the consequences of the environmental damage, is not sustainable. Since 1990, developing Asia's share in worldwide energy-related CO2 emissions has more than doubled, just in 20 years. And by 2030, this share will rise to nearly half the global total. So the consequences of not recognizing the environmental challenges, environmental damages, will start to affect growth itself and therefore not sustainable. Urbanization is a fact of life. Asia is rapidly urbanizing. China became more urban than rural in 2012. Urbanization is an inevitable process, and in the next 40 years, Asia's urban population is expected to grow from 1.6 to 3.1 billion. Cities will become the epicenter of economic life. Higher education, innovation, technological development, that's where the services are, that's where the hospitals are, that's where the schools are, people will move. But barring a few, Tokyo, Seoul, Singapore come to mind, most urban spaces, ours certainly, are very poorly designed and are not people-centric. Air pollution obviously is a major challenge. More than 500,000 people die every year due to air pollution-related causes in Asia. So, if we do not recognize the consequences of the environmental damages growth causes, it is not sustainable. And I think the point I'm making, we all are making, is that for growth to be sustainable, we've got to recognize these as explicit costs, which we have not done so far. And therefore, once again, the Asian century will just remain a dream if we don't recognize the consequences of lack of green growth. And the third element is clean growth. Now, this clean is not the same as green. This clean is as in corruption. So, as we grow, once again, one will need sound governance and robust institutions. Corruption is a tax on the poor, which then exacerbates the inequality that I talked about earlier. And for Asia, and certainly for India, I think it's important to recognize that we're not talking about rules and laws on the books, on which Asia generally has plenty of. We're really talking about how they're administered. And this is where I draw on something that Professor Sen has talked very elegantly in his many discourses on social justice. He distinguishes between niti and nyaya. Niti is basically the organizational principles, the rules, the laws. Nyaya is realized justice. And what I think we need to think of in terms of governance is nyaya, is access to justice. Whether in spite of the fact that we might have all the laws, are those laws getting implemented? Or do people at the bottom of the pyramid again have access to that justice? And it is the nyaya that we are after. Niti is a necessary condition, but not the whole point of the exercise. Clean growth has to talk about social justice, has to talk about the injustices of a girl child having to fetch water and not go to school. So in spite of the fact that you have a law talking about right to education, it doesn't really matter if the girl child can't go to school, not because there is no school, but because she has to go and fetch water. Therefore, you might have to think of rural water supply projects. So these things are very complex. We think of justice as only the courts, yes, of course, but it's also the enabling infrastructure. So the need for clean growth, as in terms of institutions and good governance, becomes important. So inclusive growth, green growth, and clean growth. Now, one fact which I think in Asia we have been very fortunate about, and that is, and Sanjay and Shyam will talk much more eloquently about that, is that our economic miracle, so-called, rests on the fact that we have had, since the Vietnam War, relative peace and stability. We have many flashpoints, we've got many tensions, but in spite of that, Asia has generally been peaceful with not any major war, and the driving force really has been economic, really put to the fore by Deng Xiaoping, who basically said it's important to have a stable external environment to facilitate internal economic development. So trade became the mantra. Greater